This is the CBS Evening News. Bob Schieffer sitting in tonight for Dan Rather. Good evening. More signs of extraordinary change in the Soviet bloc again tonight. It may sound incredible, but it now seems possible that Poland will wind up with a non-communist government headed by longtime opposition leader Lech Walesa. It's been a day of heavy political maneuvering in Warsaw, and CBS News correspondent Anthony Mason has the latest.
Lech Walesa arrived in Warsaw tonight, his once outlawed Solidarity movement suddenly on the edge of political power. After taking support of two smaller swing parties away from the communists, Solidarity tonight proposed a coalition government with Lech Walesa as prime minister. The coalition, if it holds, appears to have a majority in parliament and could lead to the formation of the first non-communist government in Eastern Europe in more than 40 years. It would be a psychological breakthrough for Poland, said this Solidarity member, and we need a psychological breakthrough because we're on the edge of economic disaster. For the communists, it would be the final humiliation in their miraculous descent. Their own attempts to form a coalition collapsed Monday when Prime Minister Czesław Kiszczak couldn't form a government after just 2 weeks in office. Walesa offered his first hint of compromise yesterday, saying the communists could keep the interior and defense cabinet posts in a Solidarity coalition.
But Walesa, personally, as a prime minister, that will be very dangerous for him, for his prestige.
It may only be a political maneuver. Walesa has said before he doesn't want the job. But Poland's next prime minister, whoever he is, will have to make some highly unpopular economic decisions. Bread lines today stretch round the block after rumors of a 200% price hike tomorrow. Walesa is expected to meet with President Jaruzelski tomorrow to begin negotiations for power. It may take days, but the Poles are good at waiting. They wait for gas, they wait for bread. Now they're waiting for a government. Anthony Mason, CBS News, Warsaw.
A man we usually talk to by satellite, CBS News correspondent Bert Quint, who's covered the Solidarity movement from the beginning and knows Lech Walesa well, is on home leave and here tonight. Bert, what must be going through Lech Walesa's mind tonight?
Bob, Lech Walesa must be as dumbstruck by this astounding turn of events as everybody else. Just a year ago, he and his followers were engaged in a strike that had failed, and they were threatened by arrest by the police. And only last month, Walesa was saying that Solidarity would not try to take control of the government because it was too dangerous. But Solidarity's men in Parliament have tasted power.
So what happens now for Walesa? What does he have to consider in all
this? It's a tough decision, Bob. He could lose either way. He knows what happened in 1981 when Solidarity pushed too hard, martial law. That conceivably could happen again. But his followers are demanding that Walesa seize the chance, and if he doesn't, he could be left behind by Solidarity on the march.
And of course, the communists would still, in a coalition government, control the army and the police. But what happens now to the Communist Party?
The Communist Party is likely to not disintegrate, but to split in two. Reformers and those who want to hold on to their positions of power prestige.
Bert, thank you very much. And there is one more startling development. Exiled author Alexander Solzhenitsyn was seen on Soviet television tonight. The interview recorded some time ago in France, but it was the first ever Soviet television appearance for Solzhenitsyn, who was expelled from the Soviet Union more than 15 years ago. The broadcast, in connection with another upcoming event once considered unthinkable, Solzhenitsyn's landmark work, The Gulag Archipelago, is about to be published for the first time in the Soviet Union. That will happen this week, and we have more on that now from Barry Peterson in Moscow.
On this windswept plain in northern Siberia, they have come to dig the bodies out of the permafrost one by one. You need a map of the gulags to find this place. Its only inhabitants now are the dead, Lithuanians exiled here by Stalin. A new generation has come to gently carry their ancestors back home. How do people get to this clandestine archipelago, wrote Alexander Solzhenitsyn? The opening words of this Gulag Archipelago. Solzhenitsyn's book was a meticulously detailed denunciation of the brutal labor camps in which he and others were imprisoned for years. For this and other books, he was exiled by furious Soviet authorities and remains today charged with treason. He lives in seclusion on a Vermont farm. The opposition to Solzhenitsyn remains. Top members of the Politburo delayed publication for years, until, by some reports, Gorbachev himself finally had to nod his head yes.
Gorbachev seems to be committed to letting as much of the truth as he can imagine come out, and that includes Solzhenitsyn.
Vadim Borisov is poring over page proofs and consulting with Solzhenitsyn by mail to decide what chapters will be published. It's a sign of change, he says, adding, Solzhenitsyn often said that the country that publishes his books will not be the same country that exiled him. It's a country where more and more criticism is heaped on Stalin, the architect of the Gulag. How many did he kill? 10 million? 20 million? He is routinely condemned in the Soviet press as an evil man. But Solzhenitsyn's Gulag is a watershed. It's not just the end of a long battle for literary freedom. It's the beginning of a debate over the very soul of this nation.
The reviews and the commentary and the reception will revive this profound, the most profound, political, ideological, intellectual issue today in the Soviet Union. Did things go wrong after the revolution or with the revolution?
Some believe the publication of the Gulag means Solzhenitsyn may be allowed to return to his homeland.
This, after all, from their point of view, is the most damaging book he's ever written. It was the reason for his arrest and exile. So if they publish it, that is a clear signal that he could return if he wished to.
On an airport tarmac in Lithuania, they bless the bodies from Siberia. The old remember them by name, Petra and Stanislavus and Laika. The young may learn their heritage from these coffins. Later, there was a service outside a Catholic church. Solzhenitsyn challenged the conscience of his country because he wrote the story of life in the Gulag. To the dead, he wrote, "Forgive me for not having seen it all." Barry Peterson, CBS News, Moscow.
And still to come on tonight's CBS Evening News, John Blackstone on the nuts and bolts of a conspiracy against the world aerospace industry, and David Dow on a heartbreaking turn in the comeback of Dave Dravecky. The Air Force cut short the second test flight of the controversial B-2 stealth bomber over California today because of a low reading on an oil pressure gauge. The plane, designed to be invisible to enemy radar, is already at the center of a funding dispute in Congress, where some say its $500 million price tag is just too high. The Navy said today that it's investigating why yesterday's Trident II missile test ended in failure. The missile triggered its own self-destruct mechanism and exploded just seconds after being launched from a submarine off the Florida coast. It was the second failure in 3 tries for the new missile designed to carry multiple nuclear warheads. The head of an aircraft parts distributing company pleaded guilty today to federal charges of selling uncertified aircraft parts to the aerospace industry for more than a decade. The case is part of a larger government investigation into substandard parts of military planes and civilian jet liners. John Blackstone now with that report.
In Seattle today, Bruce Rice, the president of Rice Aircraft, entered a guilty plea on charges that involved the sale of counterfeit and untested nuts and bolts throughout the commercial aircraft industry. His New York-based company supplies parts to what federal investigators describe as a who's who of flight.
The people who bought the parts would never have bought them if they had known where they were coming from.
Those who bought parts from Rice to help hold their aircraft together include United Airlines, TWA, American, and Pan Am. Federal investigators say Rice reprocessed surplus nuts and bolts and provided phony certificates to say the parts met required standards. In a plea bargain, Rice admitted guilt to charges of bribery and fraud, but the company insists there's no proof its products have failed.
After 2 years of investigation, the government has yet to find anything which they can in any way prove is unsafe in any way.
Federal investigators agree there's no evidence the counterfeit parts actually caused any aircraft accidents. But Rice is not the only company being investigated. There are similar questions about the practices of several of the largest suppliers of nuts and bolts to the aviation industry. Whistleblowers inside the companies say deception is widespread in an industry that relies on integrity.
You're falsifying reports saying that these parts were correctly checked and are done and ready to go out to the customer, which was bull.
Among the remains of the engine of the United DC-10 that crashed in Sioux City last month, investigators found 2 large nuts with their threads stripped away. The cause of the crash will not be determined for months, but the NTSB is testing the integrity of the nuts.
We just shouldn't have a situation where society has, in effect, got to be in a Russian roulette kind of situation as to whether or not these bolts are of adequate quality.
The importance of nuts and bolts will be recognized in proposed legislation that would put strict new controls on the small parts that hold so much together. John Blackstone, CBS News, Seattle.
The Federal Food and Drug Administration said today that it started sampling 30 of the nation's most prescribed generic and brand name drugs, the FDA under increasing criticism following disclosure that some generic drug makers have been submitting false data to the agency. 2 economic reports today offered encouraging signs that the U.S. economy could avoid a recession. Industrial production was up 0.2% in July. That reverses a 2-month decline. And housing starts rose for the 2nd straight month, apparently responding to lower interest rates. The fierce battles that have been raging in Lebanon this week between the Christian army and Syrian troops were reduced to a few skirmishes today, but it's still not clear tonight whether the warring factions plan to heed the UN Security Council's demand for an end to the bloodshed. Correspondent Martha Teichner is in London and begins our coverage of the war in Lebanon.
In Beirut, the day began with at least hope that the UN call for a ceasefire would produce results. But all it has produced is confusion, mixed signals. In Damascus, Syria's allies and every one of the factional warlords it backs in Lebanon met with President Hafez al-Assad and pledged to crush Lebanon's Christian forces. But Assad then announced he would do his utmost to silence the guns. Lebanon's Christian leader, General Michel Aoun, was quoted as saying he welcomed a ceasefire unconditionally, then immediately added conditions. Warring military forces remained on alert, waiting for orders. The fighting didn't stop, but it let up for a few hours, and an illusion of normalcy returned to Beirut. There was traffic for the first time in days, and street trading. But pessimists built bigger, stronger barricades against the onslaught they fear will come. Today's political posturing was irrelevant to those who face another 12 hours underground, passing the night with games and fear in a candlelit cellar as they live out the nightmare of General Aoun's war.
All along, his was an impossible bid for, if there's one thing that has been very clear about Lebanon the last 10 or 12 years, the Syrians are intent on preserving their own primacy.
That means the Christian forces would be crushed by the massive superiority of the Syrians, and a new flag would be raised in the burning hills of Lebanon. Martha Teichner, CBS News, London.
Since biblical times, Damascus has been center stage in the theater of Middle East history. The current round of fighting in Lebanon is part of Syria's attempts to reassert its dominance in the region. Lebanese Christian forces have vowed to throw Syria out of Lebanon.
Well, I think the Syrians regard themselves as pursuing their national interest in Lebanon, and their most important national interest there is security, the security of the western flank of Syria.
But the Christian forces have proved tougher than anyone expected at defending their turf in East Beirut, in spite of civilian casualties. This funeral was for 2 children killed by Syrian shelling while trying to escape to a Cyprus-bound ferryboat. There are reports of heavy Syrian losses, too. Syria's hard line in Lebanon has cost President Hafez al-Assad considerable support in the Arab world. The Special Arab League mission failed in its efforts to mediate in the Beirut crisis, but criticized Syria, a stand applauded by the U.S.
I think by pointing out that the attitude of Syria is not helpful and it is one of the principal obstacles, that alone is a major achievement.
Syria has warned pointedly that unless Washington changed its policy in the region, Damascus could do little to help in the hostage crisis. Syria seems prepared to use the hostage issue as a means to pursue its case for a preeminent role in Lebanon and any more wide-reaching Middle East peace initiative. Syria's influence stems from its military might, but the cost of building it has left the regime vulnerable to pressure. Estimates put Syria's IOU for Russian arms at $10 to $15 billion. observers here feel the Soviets don't expect to see the cash. They will extract repayment by trying to use Syria to push Moscow's policies in the region. The debt burden is hurting an economy already wounded by a cutoff of more than $500 million a year worth of aid from Saudi Arabia. And there may soon be shortages of essentials like bread and cooking oil. Oil production by U.S. and European companies here is as much as 100,000 barrels a day lower than hoped for. And gasoline costs recently went up 50%. The Syrians have historically reacted to pressure by digging in. The Lebanese situation is crucial to Hafez al-Assad's view of where Syria should fit in the Middle East.
The prevailing wisdom is that if the Syrians can't dominate, they'll be less than helpful and might even play the role of spoilers. Alan Pizzi, CBS News, Damascus.
In Miami today, President Bush said that he'd like to see relations with Cuba normalized, but that won't happen, he said, until Fidel Castro takes steps to give Cuba more freedom and openness. Mr. Bush accused Castro of swimming against the tide of reform that has swept other communist nations. He was in Miami to campaign for the Republicans seeking the late Claude Pepper's U.S. House seat. The head of a religious group made a grand jury appearance today in Spokane, Washington, and that proceeding was watched with interest by some residents of Montana who are worried about being neighbors to a new kind of church militant. James Hattori reports.
Paradise Valley, north of Yellowstone National Park, is one of America's beautiful places. But the growth of a New Age religious cult and the discovery of plans for an armed security force has neighbors fearing trouble in Paradise.
I am light, glowing light.
Elizabeth Clare Prophet heads the self-styled Church Universal and Triumphant, a mix of Christian and Eastern philosophies, including reincarnation. But it's the here and now that has neighbors worried. Since 1981, the church has acquired 33,000 acres to support a community of 600 believers, doubling the population of the nearest town. A huge fallout shelter is under construction. Church prophecy warns of a nuclear attack and encourages survivalism. But what has alarmed residents most is the recent arrest in eastern Washington of church staff member Vernon Hamilton, who's accused of using fake ID to buy $130,000 worth of arms, including assault rifles. Investigators say he planned to equip a 200-man church security force.
What do you need that many guns for? In fact, it scares the hell out of me.
Elizabeth Prophet says individual members may have guns, but there is no security force. She can't explain how a staff member who earns $150 a month could buy so many weapons.
I can tell you with a certainty that no church funds have been involved in the activities of Vernon Hamilton.
In Spokane today, Prophet went before a federal grand jury. Also scheduled to testify, her husband, church business manager Ed Francis, whose name has been linked to the gun purchase scheme. According to Prophet's daughter, an estranged follower, the church is covering up its activities.
I believe that, they're desperate, and desperate people do desperate things.
Such darkness as has used me.
Members recite chants which identify church critics by name. Prophet says it's prayer for their salvation. Others fear it amounts to an enemies list.
The combination of this kind of list making with the purchase of high-powered weapons is very sinister and frightening.
I want to reassure you that you do not have any cause for fear.
Growing concern in the valley prompted the church to hold an open house.
I have not approved, condoned, or accommodated in any way the stockpiling of weapons on my staff and in my church headquarters.
While church officials continue to work on damage control, federal prosecutors say their investigation may yield more suspects and charges. James Hattori, CBS News, Corwin Springs, Montana.
And weather permitting, tonight's the night to see the first total eclipse of the moon over North America in 7 years. The best view is expected in the east and Midwest. The sky show starts at about 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time. One of the things that draws us to sports of any kind is that the athletic field is the one place where dreams really can and sometimes do come true for us and the players we root for. That's why what happened to San Francisco pitcher Dave Dravecky last night seems so unfair. It just isn't the way that dreams are supposed to turn out. David Dow reports.
Just 6 days ago, San Francisco baseball fans cheered what many called a miracle. Dave Dravecky, the determined pitcher who came back from cancer of his pitching arm, from surgery to win again in the major leagues. But last night in Montreal, the miracle took a chilling turn.
Here's the pitch, and Dravecky falls over. Dravecky stumbled on the mound. He threw a wild pitch.
The agonizing pop could be heard by his teammates. Doctors quickly determined that Dravecky had broken his arm next to the spot where the cancerous tumor was removed last October.
When the crack occurred, I actually thought I lost my arm, that it had left my body.
It's possible the bone has not fully returned to a normal state. Dave is very, very powerful in his build, and so he can generate a lot of force in that rotation motion of pitching.
At the very least, Dravecky will not play again this season. It was a wrenching blow to a comeback many believed impossible. There were months of therapy to recover use of his arm after the loss of muscle in the cancer surgery. Then it was back to the minor leagues to regain his pitching form. And finally, last week's victorious return to the first-place Giants.
I feel bad for Dave because he worked so hard, to come back, and
you pray to God that everything comes out well.
Today in San Francisco, Dravecky's fans had little doubt he would be back.
He's got the will and the heart to make it back next year. He'll overcome it, I think. He came this far. He'll probably give it another shot next year.
Dravecky's doctors were optimistic, too.
I don't see any reason why he can't go through the rehabilitation program and really pitch next year.
And neither did the pitcher who today signed autographs with his injured arm and talked about the future.
As far as I'm concerned, if God wants me back on the mound again, as I said before with the cancer, I'll be there, no matter what has to be done.
Today, there was cautious talk of the next comeback day for Dave Dravecky, the next curtain call for San Francisco's Miracle Man. David Dow, CBS News, San Francisco.
That's the news. I'm Bob Schieffer, sitting in tonight for Dan Rather. Good night.
This is CBS.